Hello students, this is Dr. Aguilar-Hernández, and this lecture is titled The Construction of and Challenge to Illegality in the United States, and this is for EWS 402. To begin this lecture, I'd like to begin by beginning with the word illegality. The word illegality is something that we will discuss in this lecture and then relate back to the reading for this week. But I wanted to make sure and say a few things about the concept before we get into what it means in relationship to Latino studies. Illegality is something that has the word legal in it. The word illegality in status quo or in mainstream society assumes that if you do something that breaks the law, then you are in the space or in the position of illegality. So if you violate the law, if you break a law, then you are doing something that is quote unquote illegal. So it sounds like the word illegality sounds like the breaking of the law or the status of having broken the law. Now, who is it about? At the same time that the word illegality is about, the idea or the status of breaking the law, we could largely agree, especially in Latino studies and in mainstream media. What we have seen is that the word illegality or the status of being quote unquote illegal is largely given to those who are undocumented in terms of citizenship in the United States. So the concept of illegality, although it technically means the breaking of any law, is generally only assigned to people who are undocumented in the United States. There's a lot to be said about that because technically if I run a red light, if I jaywalk, if I do anything that is breaking the law, I'm technically in the realm or in the status of being in a state of illegality. However, again, it's largely only afforded to people who have come to the United States with undocumented status. So we have to ask the question of why is this the case? Why is the concept of illegality only applied to or largely only applied to undocumented immigrants? And then why is it generally only afforded to undocumented immigrants from very specific countries of origin? In the United States, there are many undocumented immigrants from European countries and from Canada, but generally we don't talk about the concept of illegality being extended to them. Generally, it's always assumed to be for people who come from Latin America, some Asian countries, and African countries as well. So we really need to ask the question of why is that the case? So I think what I'd like to do to have a conversation about illegality is to turn to scholars, right? So to answer this question, what do scholars say about this term or concept? I'd like to turn to one of the key scholars in this field of Latino studies and sociology that has said a lot about the concept of illegality. So I'd like to outline what Nicholas de Genova says in an article that he wrote titled "The Legal Production of Mexican/Migrant Illegality." And there's a very powerful quote that he says in that article. He says, "There is nothing matter of fact about the illegality of undocumented immigrants." He goes on to say, "Illegality is the product of U.S. immigration law." So there's something really profound about what Nicholas de Genova says in this quote here. So let's take the first part of the quote here. He says, "There is nothing matter of fact." So there is nothing matter of fact, meaning that there's nothing natural, that there's nothing, there's nothing natural. It isn't something that we are born with. It isn't something that has always existed. So there's nothing matter of fact about the illegality of undocumented immigrants. So there's nothing natural, nothing, it hasn't been set in stone forever that undocumented immigrants are in a state of illegality. He goes on to say that illegality is a product of U.S. immigration law. So he's making a really strong assertion here, and he's saying that, the quote unquote status of illegality is very much the result and is very much created by U.S. immigration law. And we'll look at some of those examples today to kind of paint the picture of what he means there. I want to make sure that you really understand this quote because you will see this quote in the midterm. So I want to make sure that you have this down and you have an understanding of this quote. Another thing that I think is important that he's saying here is that aside from illegality being the result of or a product of U.S. immigration law, we could also then extend this and say that the concept of legality is also produced by U.S. immigration law. So in defining what is quote unquote illegal, they're also defining what is quote unquote legal. Ultimately what he is saying here is that illegality isn't natural. It isn't something that we are born with, and it isn't something that has always existed. This is something that U.S. immigration law has developed over time, and it hasn't been a static state of being. What it means to be in a state of illegality today is not what it meant years ago. There are groups who were considered to be in a state of illegality many years ago who were afforded legality through different U.S. immigration laws throughout time. Now, Lacey Abrego also takes on this concept of illegality. So this is in your book, in her introduction on page 7. So you don't need to write this down, more so than maybe go to this part of your book just to make sense of what she says. But, Lacey Abrego, borrowing from Nicholas de Genova, also comments on this concept of illegality, and she expands it a little bit. She says, although public debates about immigration in the United States implicitly assume that immigrants' legal status is an innate and static characteristic, the truth is that nothing about an immigrant's position within or outside of the law is natural. On the contrary, she says, illegality, which she defines as the condition of immigrants' legal status and deportability, is historically specific and socially, politically, and legally produced. Now, Lacey Abrego, I think, really takes Nicholas de Genova's definition of illegality and takes it to another step forward, specifically looking at the Salvadoran context. So in the first part, she is asserting what Nicholas de Genova says, right? So although, there are public debates or status quo, conversations happening saying that, that basically assume that immigrants' legal status is, fixed or static, I should say, or innate. What she's saying here is what Nicholas de Genova is saying, is that there is nothing matter of fact. There's nothing natural about, this concept of legal or illegal status. And then she goes on to add this part right here by defining illegality. She says, on the contrary, illegality, and then she defines it as the condition of immigrants' legal status and deportability. So she's expanding here to say that illegality is not just whether you have legal right to be here, but she's also adding by saying that to be in a state of illegality means that your legal status sets you up into a position of being deported. So to be in a state of illegality means the constant fear of being deported. And that's something that you can't take away, because if there is no legal pathway to becoming a resident or holding legal status for your specific social group or ethnic group or group of, national origin, then you are constantly in a state of deportability. So on the way to and from work, at school, it doesn't matter where you're at, the state of deportability is always something that follows you when you live in the state of illegality. But she is saying that this condition is historically specific, meaning that it has, and that's what I'll do today, is that it has a lot to do with the relationships between the United States and, the immigrants' country of origin, in terms of what does that relationship look like. And it's very much produced socially, politically, and legally. So it's not just produced by the law, and by, what politicians are saying, but it's also produced by how people behave and think about undocumented immigrants. In this case, I'd like to say that the way that, people behave or think about undocumented immigrants is very much influenced by what politicians are saying about undocumented immigrants, and that is ultimately reflected in the law. So, the laws that we understand about, undocumented immigrants or who has legal status in the United States is very much the belief of politicians that have pushed those, philosophies forward, and is largely also accepted and embraced in social contexts. So you have everyday citizens in the United States and everyday people believing that, undocumented immigrants should be deported because of X, Y, and Z. And so there's a relationship between how people behave socially, what politicians say about illegality, and then how all of that manifests through the writing and drafting of policies and laws. So I think it's a very important definition that she gives us here, right? So, and that this has implications on the day-to-day lives of undocumented immigrants. So what does it mean to be in a state of illegality? Is really not just that you don't hold legal status, but that there's a very real risk of deportability on a day-to-day basis, and that you have to make decisions with that in mind, especially if you have families or if you have children, or if you're here and your children are back in El Salvador, then you really have to consider what that means, right? What does it mean for you to be deported? Could very much have a significant impact, not just on your life, but on the family back in El Salvador that is expecting, remittances or money from your labor. And what I really appreciate from Nicholas de Genova and Lacey Abrego is that they're, really, as scholars, they're really talking about what this means in relationship to undocumented immigrant status. So let me be more clear about that. Earlier, I was saying that, illegality, to be in a state of illegality could mean, breaking any law, like, running a red light or jaywalking. Let me say that those laws or those laws that exist that, you can't run a red light or you can't jaywalk in communities or on the streets, don't have the same risk as not having legal status. However, in the US, we have really decided as a society that immigrants that come from Latin America are creating or are committing like the biggest breaking of the law ever. So illegality, or the concept of illegality, is synonymous to undocumented immigrants because it says a lot about our society. We believe as a society that if you are coming to the United States from Latin America, that is the biggest breaking of the law in history. And although I have already shared in earlier lectures that actually undocumented immigrants contribute positively to the United States, we continue to believe that that is the case, and we continue to produce laws that limit the rights of undocumented immigrants, specifically from Latin America in the United States. And in many cases, this is racial and a bunch of other things, political and economic, and I'll lay those out as we move along. So let me give you, if you will, a historical timeline of illegality in the United States, and I think it's important to do so. The first time that we see illegality take place or take shape in the format of policy, especially in relationship to immigrants, is the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882. There is a great PBS documentary out now called The Chinese Exclusion Act, and you could watch it for extra credit and email it to me by, soon, if you're interested in doing extra credit. But the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 was really a culmination of a series of other acts and legal decisions between the United States and China, where the U.S. was establishing a relationship with China to recruit laborers from China to come to the United States and work, specifically along the West Coast in the United States, although they migrated to other parts of the United States once they were in like the California area. But, so the US before 1882 had established relationships with the Chinese government to allow specific workers to come to the United States and to work. And the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 is very much, historians would agree, a racial piece of legislation that prohibited the entry of any Chinese immigrants into the United States. So, what the Chinese Exclusion Act did was that it said if you are Chinese, you can no longer come into the United States. Now, this Chinese Exclusion Act is simultaneously being passed while there are a number of violent attacks on Chinese peoples around the United States, specifically in major urban centers or cities. And before 1882 and after 1882, there were a number of what eventually became known as Chinese massacres in the United States, where everyday people in the United States would racially profile Chinese people, workers, mostly men, and they would kill them in public settings. And so this is where I was saying earlier that illegality is not, it doesn't just create policy or law, but it also shapes the way in which society believes and behaves around that group of people. So the Chinese Exclusion Act, which says no more Chinese peoples in the United States, they can no longer come to the United States, is racially charged not just because it's specifically excluding Chinese immigrants, but because the social behavior in the United States toward Chinese peoples is very racist, to the point where people are using violent actions against Chinese individuals to the degree of killing them and blaming them and stereotyping them in ways that are very demeaning and that have everything to do with their racial identity. So this concept of illegality, specifically to the relationship of undocumented status today, is really born out of the Chinese Exclusion Act, and in many ways has very little to do with Mexicans at that time, and as you will see, has everything to do with Mexicans as time moves on. The Immigration Act of 1917, just a few decades after the Chinese Exclusion Act, was another important piece of legislation because it barred immigrants from any Asian country to the United States. So after the Chinese Exclusion Act became enacted and prohibited, legal migration of Chinese immigrants into the United States, what you began to have was really other Asian groups migrating into the United States, mostly as workers. So specifically Japanese and Filipino workers began to come to the United States to work. And the Immigration Act of 1917 actually bars immigrants from any Asian country to come. The irony of all of this was that you had, Filipino, Japanese, and Chinese workers and children of these folks serving in World War I on behalf of the United States. So it really shows the irony here of second-class citizenship also being afforded to Asian, workers and military personnel at this time. So Immigration Act of 1917 is specifically important to understanding this concept of illegality. So who replaces Asian laborers if Asians are no longer allowed to come to the United States because of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Immigration Act of 1917, and they are largely the ones that are staffing specific labor positions in the US, then who replaces this cheap labor, right? And the answer is that around the same time, and specifically 1910, there is a great migration from Mexico because of the Mexican Revolution. I'll say a few things about the Mexican Revolution, and that is that between 1876 and 1910, there was a dictator in place who his name is Porfirio Diaz, and this is known as the Porfiriato time period in Mexican history. He really privatized the land in Mexico, which led to extreme poverty amongst people of Mexican descent. The middle class really dwindles. So you're either a few of the rich or many of the poor. So because of his dictatorship in up until 1910, people got together and revolted against the Mexican government. So people like Zapata and Villa, so Francisco Villa or Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata are two leaders, and also Las Adelitas, which was a group of revolutionary women, Mexican women, that led the Mexican Revolution against the Porfirio Diaz regime. And it was about 11 years of revolution that took place in Mexico. So, because there's a revolution in Mexico, the people are fighting their own country. People leave Mexico and they come to the United States, and specifically ending up in places like Los Angeles. So, that's happening at the same time that the US is barring immigrants from China and from the Asian continent. Now, interestingly enough, right after you start seeing a wave of Mexican immigrants coming to the United States, the Immigration Act of 1924 is enacted. And there's a series of other immigration acts that you could look up on your own, but this specific one is interesting because what it does is that it sets up a quota system. For the first time, it sets up a quota system in the U.S. And it gives like this very kind of loose definition of who can come into the United States. It gets a lot more refined over time throughout the 20th century. But ultimately, what the Immigration Act of 1924 says is that the U.S. is going to prioritize white immigrants, specifically immigrants from European countries. It's not interested in immigrants from Latin America or from the Asian continent. So the Immigration Act of 1924 is ultimately saying that you have to, if you will, have a certain relationship to the United States. So not everyone is going to be welcomed in the same way to the U.S. We're basically going to prioritize white immigrants, specifically from Europe, to enter. Now, this is important because what does that mean for Mexicans is that they aren't necessarily talked about in the Immigration Act of 1924. So they're here, they're generally staying here through the Immigration Act of 1924. Although the 1930s is a time when there's the Great Depression in the United States, and there's this movement called repatriation, in which the US federal government moved to repatriate or to deport Mexicans from the United States back to Mexico. And this was law. This was a time period in which if you were considered to be an undocumented Mexican, that you were deported back to Mexico in an effort that somehow that was going to fix our economic crisis called the Great Depression. So what I'm saying here is that Mexicans were blamed for the Great Depression. There's a number of propaganda pieces during the time and signage that was put up across the United States asking Mexicans to go home. What was interesting about this time period of repatriation was that it was supposed to be specifically for undocumented Mexicans. However, there were a large percentage of the people who were repatriated were actually US-born Mexicans. So this is why I'm claiming here that this is also a racial act or a racial, legislation. So this idea of illegality, or what it means to be Mexican in the 1930s in the United States, means that you are deemed to be quote-unquote illegal, and therefore the law was to repatriate you because you are taking jobs. You are, this is the assumptions that are being made at the time, that Mexicans are taking Americans' jobs, that they are draining the system, the financial system, or the economic system, that they're just coming and taking and not getting back to the United States. So to be repatriated in the 1930s was not just because you were undocumented, it was because you were Mexican. And this is the group that specifically gets targeted in the 1930s through these sets of repatriation policies. Now, in the 1940s, the Bracero program, because of U.S. participation in World War II, welcomes Mexicans back on a, if you will, temporary visa workers permit, guest worker program, system. And, 1954, the United States passes Operation Wetback, which is really, we'll talk about that in a later lecture. more in depth, but this is really a piece of legislation that shows that specifically for undocumented Mexicans, look at the title of the word, right, of this policy. It's actually called Operation Wetback. And really what that piece of legislation was, was that it deemed anyone who is Mexican and undocumented as, deportable. And in 1954, even though the Bracero program is still going on and there's a large influx of Mexican immigrants coming to the United States still, they are very much using policy to deport Mexicans. So, what is a historical time limit of illegality is that it extends beyond people of Mexican descent and Latino descent. It includes other groups outside of Asian groups. It also includes other groups from Europe and other Latino groups that I haven't highlighted here. But do know that this is just a quick snapshot of what illegality looks like. And that is that the legal status of people, of humans, specifically of racial groups, is limited through policy and through social behavior. And as I've kind of been saying, and that's a big part of this course, is that labor is a big part of this conversation. Why are people coming to the United States? One of the biggest reasons is work. And they're coming here because there's work here for them that pays better than their home countries, but that still pays them low wages or the lowest wages in the United States. So to expand more on the concept of Mexican illegality, I return back to Nicholas de Genova because he makes some really important arguments in his work. One of the things that we find about specifically how Mexicans get afforded this position of illegality in society, he reminds us that before 1965, although the 1924 Immigration Act set quota systems, there wasn't a quota system in place for Mexicans up until 1965, which means that there wasn't a policy that said only certain number of Mexicans could come to the United States or a certain percentage of people could come into the United States from Mexico. That wasn't the case. Again, the 1924 Act was really about setting limitations on immigrants from Asia and really about welcoming immigrants from Europe, specifically white immigrants. So why is 1965 important? That's because this is when we have the enactment of the Immigration Law of 1965. If you will, the Immigration Law of 1965 is really much a follow-up to the 1924 Immigration Act. The Immigration Law of 1965 puts limitations on Mexican immigrants. So it says, only a certain number of Mexicans could come to the United States. And even then, it's still loose. It's a little bit more defined than the 1924 Act, but it's still quite loose. It's just like, percentages and kind of, numbers. There isn't really like an equitable or logical understanding of why, certain numbers and percentages are being given to different groups. But what is clear in the Immigration Law of 1965 is that Mexicans are now being targeted by saying, only a certain amount can come. And what that means is that it really opens up, the migration. So in one end, it begins to set the soil, if you will, it begins to set the ground for very much an anti-Mexican tirade, which already had been happening, but really now becomes legal in 1965 by saying only a certain amount of Mexicans can enter. But this also coincides with the ending of the Bracero program in 1964. So I said in an earlier lecture the importance of the ending of the Bracero program of 1964, which now grants anyone who is a Bracero and decides to stay in the United States undocumented status. So, and although there are a lot of deportations happening between the 40s and 60s in the United States, it really begins to show that Mexican immigrants are becoming this group of people who are very much encompassing this concept of illegality. They're by policy being targeted by this Immigration Law of 1965. And again, this isn't the case for European white immigrants. They are not being told you cannot come in the numbers that you're coming in. in certain ways. It's actually prioritizing immigrants from Europe. And the irony there is, of course, that the US hasn't necessarily entered European countries to destroy their land, right? Or to cause poverty. So it's actually welcoming immigrants from Europe, but it's not welcoming immigrants from Mexico, where the US has systematically intervened historically to, take resources, privatize land, and by default, what that does is that it creates Mexican migration, and it doesn't necessarily consider that as a part of this creation. Now, what's also important here about the Immigration Law of 1965 is that it also ends the Chinese Exclusion Act. And this is important because we have to ask the question of what that means, right? So the Immigration Law of 1965, amongst a bunch of other things, sets limitation on Mexican immigrants, and but it also ends the Chinese Exclusion Act. So, is this? Some legal scholars have looked at this and said, is this where the United States shifts from? Uh, you know, is this where the United States shifts from accusing Chinese people as, or kind of relieving Chinese people as the group of illegality, to now affording this to Mexicans? And some people have, argued that yes, they do, that this is the precise moment, or at least in the legal law, where we see a shift in terms of how the U.S. treats Chinese workers and immigrants, and then how it shifts over to Mexican immigrants. Now, at the same time that this is happening, between the 60s and 70s, Mexico opens its border areas to U.S. corporations. So specifically the lands on the Mexico side near the border, Mexico opens that area to the United States corporations. And what it does is that it allows U.S. corporations to open up what in Spanish are called maquiladoras, which are ultimately factories. And these factories open up on the Mexico side, so Mexico gets some money out of this. And what Mexico does that as a way to welcome deported Mexicans back to labor opportunities on the Mexico side. So who is winning here are both governments. The Mexico government is being cut a check for allowing U.S. corporations to open on the Mexico side. And as the U.S. is deporting Mexicans, Mexico has now, if you will, created labor opportunities for Mexicans who are being deported back to Mexico to work in factories. However, this didn't work out as planned, because what this actually did is that as maquilas are being built, migrants from all over Mexico are attracted to the border. So really what you have is Mexicans being deported back to the border, and also people migrating up to the border. So cities like Tijuana or cities like Juarez, which are on opposite ends. Juarez is in Mexico, El Paso, and Tijuana, of course, is in the near Chula Vista or San Isidro in San Diego County. Really, what you start having is a lot of Mexicans being in this area. Some of them deported. Some of them coming up for labor opportunities, specifically around these maquilas. And the irony here, you might have noticed already, is that Mexican workers continue to work for U.S. corporations. So even though they were working for U.S. corporations on the U.S. side, and then if they get deported, they still work for U.S. corporations. So at the end of the day, who makes the most profit off of Mexican laborers is U.S. corporations. So what does this set up, right, is an important question to ask. This kind of historical context is that what it does is that it builds a supply for U.S. labor demands. And because border towns receive deportees or people who are deported, what this does is that in very close proximity, the U.S. labor market is who benefits the most at the expense of Mexican laborers and Mexican immigrants. Specifically Mexican immigrant laborers. So when we need you, we will call you. And when we don't need you, we will let you go. But we will continue to benefit from your labor by opening up these, factories that will continue to profit us. And the interesting thing about maquiladoras or factories on the Mexico side that are US owned is that it's cheaper to operate on the Mexico side, so you don't have to pay your workers benefits, you don't have to pay them overtime, or you don't have to pay them because that isn't legislated on the Mexico side, especially with US corporations, and you can let them go whenever you want. And you don't have to pay them minimum wage like you do in the US. So actually the profit for US corporations on the Mexico side is significantly cheaper. I mean, it's significantly higher. So US corporations make more money off of opening factories outside of the US because they could pay workers lower amounts of money and they don't have to pay all these other things that is required in the United States. So again, who is winning here is U.S. corporations and governments, the Mexican and the U.S. government. Who is losing is this group of undocumented immigrants or groups of undocumented immigrants who are racialized and also being used for labor. And I think it's important then to kind of assert that as U.S. policies continue over time, beyond the 60s and 70s, Mexicans and Latinas and Latinos, right? So not just people of Mexican descent, but as we've learned through the Lacey Abrego book, Central Americans continue to immigrate to the United States. They continue to come into the United States. And they continue to serve as laborers in and for U.S. corporations, whether it's in their home country or in the United States. They're workers, and they're workers for U.S. corporations. And they are also sometimes deported. So this is, if you will, the relationship of illegality for specifically people of Mexican descent. And here I'm extending it to other Latinas and Latinos because that's what's happening, is that Latinas and Latinos are largely impacted by these sets of policies and by these limitations of legal status, which by default makes them deportable and also expendable. But at the end of the day, U.S. corporations and the Mexico and the U.S. government continue to benefit largely by this illegality status of Latinas and Latinos because they get profit off of deporting Latinas and Latinos. So in many ways, this concept of illegality is a dehumanizing effort. The law and the labor practices are incredibly dehumanizing to undocumented immigrants because it values their labor. In the U.S., it pays them less for their labor. And then if you are considered deportable, even though you're contributing to the U.S. economy and bringing profit and economic stability to the U.S., the lack of legal status makes you deportable on a day-to-day basis. So this is dehumanizing. But at the same time, because poverty is high in a lot of Latin American countries because of U.S. intervention and colonialism in these countries, and crime and all these things are happening, people continue to come. So it's a vicious cycle. We have people coming, but it's better here than it is there. So that's why they come. Right? These people are smart. They know why they're coming. It's better here than it is there. And they come for that, and they continue to work, whether it's here or in their home country. And many times, this labor benefits U.S. interests and U.S. corporations. Now, I have to pause here for a minute to ask the question of what is legal. And this is very much inspired by Jose Antonio Vargas, who I will quote in a minute. But if you look at the history of legality in the U.S. and extend this beyond immigration, there's an important lesson to be said here and to kind of make sense of in terms of legality. In South Africa, there was an apartheid period between 1948 till 1990, in which there was a terrible movement of killing ethnic communities in South Africa. The government deemed this legal, and the government was actually killing specific ethnic Africans in South Africa as a way of emptying the land or removing people from the land. This was legal. Okay, this was legal because the government said so. It was law, it was policy. And in 2018, when we look back at South Africa and the apartheid, we understand that this was a terrible mistake. The idea of allowing a government to justify the killing of um, Black peoples, in South Africa, today we look at that with shame. So this was considered legal at the time. What was also considered legal was the Holocaust under the Hitler regime and dictatorship of 1941 to 1945, where he made it legal to basically to rip families apart, specifically Jewish families, and to and other families, of course, including LGBT members of the community. But basically, during the Holocaust between 1941 and 1945, it was legal to put specific people into concentration camps, and it was legal to separate them from their families, right? It was legal to take everything they had away from them, to separate them. It was legal to put numbers on them, to tattoo, numbers on them, to put badges on them that identified who they were as undesirable peoples. It was legal between 1941 and 1945 to justify their death because they were considered less human than Germans at that time. What was also considered legal in the United States is slavery, beginning in 1619 in specifically the American context, or specifically in U.S. context, is the first time we see the arrival of African slaves arriving to present day United States. And in 1641, it becoming legal under the British Crown, that it was legal to bring slaves and to sell slaves and to use slaves in the creation of the 13 colonies. And in 1776, when the U.S. Gains its independence from the British, slavery is maintained as a legal process, and it stays in place up until 1865. So between 1619 all the way to 1865, it was legal to enslave Black people in the United States. Okay. Why I say that is because it's important to understand the limitations of what legality means. What is also important to understand is that in the United States, even with slavery ending in 1865, what we saw was the creation of Jim Crow laws, which were segregation laws, which meant that blacks and whites had to be separate in public spaces. They couldn't use the same drinking fountains, swimming pools, courthouses. They weren't going to be paid the same. If Black people were going to be paid for the work, they weren't going to be paid the same as white workers. And they definitely weren't going to be working in the same capacities. That's the Jim Crow laws of 1865 to 1965. 100 years of separate but equal policies, and laws. Some state level, some local level, some neighborhood level. Like some neighborhood Jim Crow law examples are like the swimming pool, that like Black people could only swim in the swimming pool the day before the swimming pool was cleaned. So those are examples of Jim Crow laws, and that was legal in the U.S. up until 1965. Right? What was also legal is colonialism throughout the world. So when you had primarily European countries going throughout the world and colonizing lands, not only the majority of the American continent, the Caribbean, but also Australia, what we know today as Australia, the Pacific Islands, and many of the Asian, Southeast Asian specifically areas. So that is considered legal, right? That is something that the Spanish government or the British government or the Portuguese government said, hey, we are taking over, this plot of land, and we have a policy that says that this is legal, right? We wrote this law. Also, the Palestine-Israel conflict is one of legality, one that it has been happening for decades, but has really gotten us as a U.S. community, and also, in ethnic studies, to think more about this conversation, where the state of Israel, so not Jewish people, but the state of Israel, so the government of Israel, has used all sorts of efforts to displace Palestinian peoples from their land in an effort to colonize and take over the entire Palestinian region, and to make this now the state of Israel. A very complicated and complex story, specifically considering Jewish prosecution. However, what I want to highlight here is that what is considered legal is that the state of Israel and that the United States government have said that it's legal for Israel to displace Palestinians from their land, from their original land. Um, and they have justified what really some scholars have called a genocide of Palestinian peoples taking place by the Israeli government, and also by, being supplied and financed largely by U.S. tax dollars, in which Palestinians are being killed and murdered, and silenced and removed from their land. So this is legal because the Israeli government and the U.S. government says that it's legal. What's also been considered legal is the current detention of Latino immigrants at the Mexico-U.S. border. That is considered legal today. The images of children being torn away from their families is considered legal. The placing of children into cages, and into these makeshift tent prison camps, and what some people have equated to concentration camps, is being considered legal, right? Because the government is saying that it's legal, and it's writing policy to say this is legal, right? So I return here to Jose Antonio Vargas, who, in a very powerful statement that he made in the last years, he said, "Legality is a matter of power, not justice." And why I think this quote is important is because it really highlights the irony out of all of this, all these many examples that I've been giving you about what is legal. Just because it's legal does not mean that it is right. Because in 2018, we look back at South Africa, at the Holocaust, at slavery, the Jim Crow laws, and colonialism, at least those 5 examples that I've given you, and we look back at those, and we actually look back at those, and generally speaking, we say that was wrong. Historically, those were wrong practices, those were bad laws, those were bad policies, because it dehumanized and killed people in a way that really just asserts that this was about power, that this wasn't about justice. So I bring that up because I think it's important to understand that when we understand how undocumented immigrants, specifically Latino undocumented immigrants, are treated in the U.S. today, and when they are largely confined to the status of illegality, that we need to understand that just because the law says something does not mean that it is right. It does not mean that it is justice. If anything, it asserts that governments have certain powers over people, and that is does not reflect in any way, shape, or form the stories and the reasons why people migrate. So in asserting that people are quote unquote illegal, what you're taking away from them is their story and their narrative of why they picked up and left. You're also washing your hands from the responsibility to inquire why people leave their country, and did my country have anything to do with why these people left? Or did my government and their government have anything to do with why those people left from one place to another? So illegality is dangerous because it erases the possibility of immigrants having stories to tell. And it doesn't mean that because there's a law or a policy that that's the right thing to do. If anything, law is very much a creation of power. It really manifests what governments and politicians want. And that isn't always the well-being of people. It's very much the well-being of corporations and profit. I think what's also important to say here to end this slide is that what is illegal during these historical moments is resisting. So if you resisted apartheid in South Africa, if you resisted being detained during the Holocaust, if you tried to run away as a slave, if you sat in the wrong part of the bus, if you challenged the colonial power entering your land. If you are Palestinian and you challenge the Israeli government coming and taking your land away or your home away or killing your child, or if you are someone who is protesting the detention of Latino immigrants, that itself is considered illegal during these times. So there's actual laws and policies that at the same time are justifying slavery or Jim Crow laws or the detention of immigrants that are also saying it's illegal to challenge these systems. So you could actually serve time in jail or in other cases die or be killed and be legally killed if you resist. Right? So it's important to put those side by side. That in retrospect, in historical retrospect, we are proud of people who resisted the Holocaust and slavery and the Jim Crow laws and colonialism and the apartheid in South Africa. But we need to understand that at that historical moment, that resistance was technically illegal. And that some of them were captured and killed. Some of them, we don't know their stories. Some of them served time in jail, like Rosa Parks during the Jim Crow laws, specifically her challenge of refusing to sit in the back of the bus during the Birmingham, Alabama, bus boycott, and those are just examples, right, of how what is considered legal is unjust. And what we would consider to be justice, which is resisting these unjust laws, the state goes and says, well, that's actually illegal. You can't question us, or you can't run away from slavery. And if you do, the law is actually going to punish you for doing that. So related to this concept of illegality is the concept of the revolving door. And what scholars have argued is that the way that illegality is maintained throughout history is what scholars are calling the revolving door model. And the revolving door really comes off of literally the revolving door image that you see here. If you've gone to hotels or fancy restaurants or whatnot, there's usually this revolving door thing where it's constantly turning, right? So it's constantly turning here. The door is constantly turning, which means that you could enter and then exit. You could move in, right? If you're outside and you want to go into the hotel, you could walk into this door, and as it's revolving, you enter the hotel. It also means if you want to exit, that you go back in through here and exit out, right? So there's constantly a revolving door, which means there's a constant circular motion that's happening. Now, what Nicholas DeGenova and other scholars around immigration have discussed is that the US actually has a revolving door set of policies when it comes to immigration. That is that the US welcomes immigrants, but also deports immigrants, and that this is ongoing throughout time. I'll show you a more clear example of that in a minute. But I think that the revolving door image or model helps us understand what Lacey Abrego has been talking about in relationship to transnationalism and transnational families. Because US policy welcomes immigrants and simultaneously deports them, this set of policies over time actually systematically creates transnational families. So it's incredibly normal, if you will, to have transnational families when immigrants from Latin America are operating in a revolving door set of immigration policies. So the risk of deportability is always there. If you have managed to come to the US and gain some type of status, but you can't leave, what that does is that it creates transnational families. So it's very popular and normal to have part of your family in El Salvador and part of your family in Chicago or in Los Angeles. It also makes the case for transnationalism, and that is that the US actually depends on transnational labor efforts. We need people to come in, and the US also simultaneously deports them as a way of maintaining this immigration policy. In future lectures, we'll talk about what this means, why specifically this happens in labor. and the relationship between Latinas and Latinos and labor. So to kind of illustrate how this revolving door has happened with a set of other events that I just shared a little bit ago, if we take a quick historical look at the early 20th century of how the revolving door looks, during the Mexican Revolution and World War I, Mexicans are welcomed, right? The anti-immigrant laws of 1921 and 1924, Mexicans are generally kind of cautioned to stop coming in such big numbers, but there isn't like a quota system put in place, right? But then you have the Roaring 20s, so the 1920s up until the 1930s, where the economy in the U.S. is blooming. It's doing really well. We just got out of World War I. We limit immigration. So generally, we welcome Mexicans, and we're not necessarily deporting Mexicans in the 1920s. However, during the Great Depression, we deport them because we blame them for the Great Depression, so they're not welcomed. But then we enter World War II. So, oh no, by the way, come back, braceros. We need you to come work for us. But then Operation Wetback happens in 1954, and we say, okay, never mind, we don't need you here anymore, please leave. So this is an example of the revolving door over time, and that is how historical events and policies are created based on the political and economic needs of the US, but also the political and economic needs of a country of origin, in this case, Mexico. So really what we see is an exiting and entry of Mexicans back and forth into the US, proper. So what is the challenge to illegality? That's part of the title. So if we know what illegality is and we understand that it is a social construction, it's something that isn't real, it's something that is made to be with the interest of, politicians, society, and economic interests, specifically U.S. corporations in this case. We understand that illegality is dangerous because it erases the possibility of us to understand why people migrate. Then what is the challenge to illegality? What is the response to the damaging effects of illegality, especially since we know now, after this lecture, that what is deemed illegal could actually be the efforts of justice throughout time. So what is the challenge? And this is my take on it. The challenge to this concept of illegality is something that I've been saying throughout the course, is that humans are not illegal, right? And if we believe that humans are illegal, then what we are doing is that we are doing something that is anti-justice. We are doing something that really dehumanizes people, right? The legal status of people is best informed, not just by saying, oh, this person is this, right? Because they don't have papers, they're this, therefore they're disposable. We really need to understand that their legal status is best informed by understanding the push and pull factors that explain their migration. So we need to understand why they left and why they came here. And we need to understand the political and economic relationships between the US and their country of origin to better understand their position in the United States, or why they came to the United States. See, the status quo, mainstream media, generally doesn't have that conversation around people who are undocumented and come to the United States border, especially from Latin America. We don't want to know why they left or why they came. And we don't want to understand if our governments had anything to do with that migration. So the challenge to illegality is really to stop using the word illegal, to stop using it altogether, to interrupt it, to start calling people what they are, which is they are human, they are immigrants, they're undocumented immigrants. In some cases, they're political and economic refugees. They're escaping certain conditions in their countries of origin. And they're coming to the United States because of push and pull factors that are largely informed by political and economic relationships between the US and their country of origin. And that this is different for other immigrants from other countries. So if you're trying to immigrate from Europe, no problem. As a matter of fact, if you're undocumented from Europe, very easy to get legality in the United States are a lot less difficult than it is if you're Latina, Latino. So the challenge to illegality is stop using the I word. I want to start, referring to it as the I word from here on out. I encourage you to not use it in your writing and your day-to-day works, because what it does is that it really dehumanizes immigrants, and it also is just inaccurate. Technically, anybody who breaks the law is quote unquote illegal. But we don't call someone who jaywalked or ran a red light, risking, things, a person, we don't call them illegal, right? We identify that there's certain things that they did, but that doesn't mean that they get this kind of name assigned to them or this label slapped onto their chest, like for the rest of their lives. So we really need to stop using that word, because it's actually historically inaccurate, and it's actually produced through the law, and maintained through politicians and status quo. And really what it does is that it feeds the paranoia and the anxiety, or the idea that immigrants are somehow taking from this country and not giving back, and that they don't belong here. But as I shared in an earlier lecture, immigrants are actually contributing significantly to the United States, and they're also settling in the United States despite unequal quality of life in relationship to whites. So the illegal word is dehumanizing, and it's produced by the law and by society, and we need to interrupt it in the way that we think. Now, the reading for this lecture is Lacey Abrego's chapter 4, and I just want to ask a couple of questions and make a couple of assertions to help you with your writing assignment for this week. A couple of things that I think she answers is that she looks at this question of how does illegality impact transnational families. So I want you to make sense of that as you think about this response for this week. Is, how does this concept of illegality impact transnational families? If you will, one of the things that she says is that families can't migrate together. So what this does is that some part of the family is in the United States with undocumented status, because it's more difficult to move entire families across, in the Salvadoran context, across 3 borders. And she also then, talks about the limitations of illegality for transnational families. So I want to ask, also, so what is legality, especially for transnational families, as she's been asserting so far in the book, is that it's an idea, it's a status that is systematically denied to the majority of Salvadorans. But it's a dream, it's an aspiration, but it's incredibly difficult to access. The current presidency has actually ended TPS, or the Temporary Protective Status, which is a type of legal status for Salvadorans. And this means that there are even less Salvadorans that are going to have access to legal status in the United States. So what is legality for Salvadorans, but what is it especially for transnational families? Knowing that part of your family could be back in El Salvador, and the family that is here doesn't have really full citizenship, or not all of them have full U.S. citizenship, or some of them are being denied legality. And then I think she does a really good job in chapter 4 around talking about the impact of illegality on everyday people, by looking at how transnational families experience trauma, not only as a result of the journey of immigration, but also of the impact of illegality, or the lack of legal status, and the everyday possibility of deportability onto children and families. So she gives some really strong examples of how illegality and trauma overlap, or how illegality relates to trauma. So this concludes the lecture for this. Thank you.